Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through a list of some adult fantasy works with actual adult characters, and in order for books to qualify to be on this list, these characters have to have their own agency within the story, they have to have their own perspectives within the story, they can't just be a side character who's relegated to the position of mentor or parent. So part of why I wanted to do this video is because I definitely think that while it's fantastic that we have stories where young voices can be at the forefront, and it's great that we have entire age ranges dedicated to that, and that we still get to see that contained within some of the perspectives we have in adult fantasy. At the end of the day, something that I think a lot of us appreciate about works of fiction in general is having as many experiences in life reflected. And with there being such an emphasis on young voices in stories, I do think sometimes we lose a little bit of the experiences that you tend to more likely have when you're a little bit older. And so that's why I wanted to specifically showcase some books that I think really have that. I have done this style video a couple times in the past. I'll have those videos linked, but really quick, just in case you don't want to have to go back to those videos, I'm going to list off the books I talked about in those, and then for today I'm going to actually go in detail about the books I haven't talked about just yet. So the ones that were referenced in those videos, we have Sword of Kaigen, Way of Kings, Paladin's Grace, The Art of Prophecy, the 5th season, Witcher, Vicious, Queens of Renthia, specifically the second book in that series and the third as well, Mistborn Era 2, and The Wolf of Orinyaru. So if you do want to check any of those books out or hear a little bit more information, I'll have any reviews I've done for those as well as those videos, and I'll have them linked in the description bar in case you're like, well, if they've got them, I at least want to just have them available to check out easily. So all that said, jumping into the list of books today, I somehow thought I had definitely talked about this one in the past, and the fact that I haven't, I feel like is an oversight on my end, because not only does this have an adult main perspective, it also does so many things differently. I love to often poll all of you when it comes to certain topics having to do with not just fantasy, but fiction in general. And there's so many things that so many of us are frustrated that we see over and over again. And this book's like, I know we're frustrated with all of that, so let's do a lot of things differently. And that would be The Adventures of Amina Al-Sirafi. So first off, which is the point of this video, our main character, Amina, is somebody who she definitely has a reputation. She is this adventurer, and she is somebody who has lived a lot of life. She's made a lot of enemies as well as allies, and she's pretty ready to sort of turn her back on all of that to care for her daughter. However, there is a part of her that definitely misses that life, as it was so much a part of kind of her calling. It's something that really motivated her and that she couldn't get enough of. She loves life at sea. She loves kind of the sneakiness of the deal, and she just kind of loves that being on edge style of life, and sort of sitting back and just taking everything one day at a time isn't quite her forte, but she's doing what she can to protect her daughter. However, she also doesn't have the means to give her daughter what she feels is the best life possible. And there is sort of this one last job that comes calling that seems too good to be true, but if she can accomplish this task, then she has her daughter's life set. She doesn't have to ever worry about her daughter being in danger or wanting for anything. And so she takes it upon herself to go on this one last quest, which, as she expected, there's a lot more in store for her. And it sounds a little bit, I feel like, cliche, because a lot of times when you do have older perspectives, you do have this setup of like, oh, there's this one last job. And while I know we've seen that a fair amount of times, I do think that this book still is an absolute blast. It has a lot of twists and turns. It also has a setting that is one we don't see very often in fantasy, which was a lot of fun. And it's somewhat historical fantasy as well. I just thought it was such a good time. I definitely hope that we get more in the series, because I could see us just kind of, I don't know, like just dropping into a new adventure with Amina, and it could be right after the events of this book. It could be years after this book. We could just kind of always poke around at her life, and we could do prequels and look at things she's done in the past. If you are somebody who kind of misses that adventure feel in your stories, if you like something like the Indiana Jones movies, not saying that they're one for one, but just that sort of adventurous, we're going on this epic quest sort of feeling, I definitely think that you're going to enjoy adventures of Amina Al-Sirafi. And her age definitely plays a role in the story. She's often like, geez, my knees. So I appreciate that about her because I'm not her age, and already sometimes if I've been playing too many sports or running too much, I'm like, geez, I can't even walk today. And I get all annoyed and I'm like, is this what is in store for me for the rest of my life? And maybe it is, but at least Amina can represent where life is going. Next up, we have Guards by Terry Pratchett. So this is the first time I've dipped my toes into Discworld, and a lot of you know, even if something didn't 100% work for me, I still recommend it, and that would be the case with this story. There are a lot of things, though, that I thought it did phenomenally. I think it takes a nice examination of our own society, but then sort of spits it back out in a very satirical, funny, palatable way. And I do appreciate stories that manage to do that. I do like a lot of the humor that is present in this. But the idea for the story and the way in which it fits with today's topic is that you have a group of men who are guards. They're sort of the city watch, and they're very apathetic. Nothing really ever changes. Some people are in power. Those people usually stay in power. Even if those people lose power, somebody else steps in and you're dealing with the same old, same old. So there's this sense of bleakness almost, but with the hilarity that ensues throughout the adventure portion of the story. But we have these guards that are just kind of like, well, whatever. I mean, I'll just do my job and then go home, I guess. And then one day, a young man who's tall and strong and a little oblivious to the ways of the world comes in with a hopeful spirit, and he sort of shakes things up, and then these older guys are suddenly like, oh, maybe we should try? I don't know if I want to try. I feel like this young guy is just going to have to learn the ways of the world, but it's sort of like a clashing of hope and optimism with like cynicism, and I do feel like that clash was definitely very amusing. Next up, we have some Kingfisher works. She does feature a lot of different ages throughout her story, so I'm going to mention two today that both have adult characters, and that would be Nettle and Bone and What Moves the Dead. What Moves the Dead is a novella, and it does have a sequel now. Previously, it was just a standalone. I actually think I liked the second book more, but this doesn't just have an adult character. It has a character that has experienced war, and there are, I think, really great representations of PTSD shown in these two books thus far. I imagine we might get more. It's called the Sworn Soldier series, so I imagine we might get more entries at some point. The setup for these is that you're looking at our main character named Alex as they are experiencing things that feel very surreal and potentially have some outside influences that are affecting things that don't really feel like they're of this world. And in the first one, it is a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher. And in the second one, you are looking at something transpiring that may or may not be a result of things that can occur naturally. It's sort of one of those situations where you can't tell, because it is historical fantasy, if there are other influences, or if it's just that the people of that time don't have an explanation yet. But regardless, it is still very creepy and very edge of your seat. You really don't know what's going on exactly, and it messes with your head in a lot of ways, which I liked quite a bit about those. But it really is the examinations of PTSD that I think made that stand out for me. And then with Nettle and Bone, this one is not a novella, but it is very, very short. If you are somebody who maybe doesn't have all the time in the world to read these big epic fantasy works, but you do love fantasy, especially adult fantasy, Kingfisher is a good author to check out because she does write a lot of shorter fiction. But with Nettle and Bone, you are, which you've probably heard me talk about before, so you might want to just skip over this part because I do talk about it a lot. But you're following a young woman named Mara, whose sister has been married off for an alliance that their kingdom very much needs to protect the general population. But the man that she's been married to is abusive, and Mara wants to rescue her sister. However, she recognizes that she can't just whisk her off, as that will obviously end the alliance, and then it puts their whole country at risk. So she's trying to find a way to help her sister where it's not obvious that there has been anybody interfering. And so she kind of pulls together a very eclectic group of individuals to go on this quest. And it is a lot of fun. It's cheeky. It sounds really dark given the main motivation of our main character, but it definitely is quite amusing, and still to this day, one of my favorite, if not still my favorite, Kingfisher work. I really love Nettle and Bone a lot. Next up, we have Shadow of the Gods. So I was just saying, if you don't have all the time in the world to check out epic fantasy, check out T. Kingfisher. But if you do have time to check out epic fantasy, Shadow of the Gods. This is specifically the first book in the Bloodsworn trilogy. This is the first. Hunger of the Gods is out, and then the last book in the series it's projected to be released this year. So that's very exciting. So if you wanted to jump into it now would be a good time for that. But regardless, you do have a few different perspectives in this series, and one of them is sort of that mama bear perspective, and she's awesome. I feel like so many of the people that read this series, she ends up standing out as their favorite, and I pretty much on repeat talk about the fact that something that's very impressive about the series is the way in which the characters take turns being the most interesting perspectives, because oftentimes in multiple POV stories, there's one character that stands out that is your favorite and is generally agreed upon to be the favorite. And then there's some characters that are super boring, or it's more niche, like, oh, I love this character because of this specific thing, but most people don't really like this perspective. It's sort of a trade-off. However, I do think that John Gwynne takes the time to really make everybody interesting and to have everybody's stories be compelling, captivating, and they take turns being the perspectives you want to spend the most time with. But Orca is just so cool. She's the coolest character. She's one of the coolest characters I've come across. And she's kind of just wants to keep to herself. Seems like she has a dark past. Seems like she's ready to just let that go for the sake of her family. She doesn't want to be called back. It's kind of the opposite of there's this one last mission to get the band back together. She's like, I don't want anything to do with anybody else. I don't want anything to do with anything except my family, my husband, and my child. That's it. Leave me alone otherwise. And sometimes life isn't that kind, and you get called back to stuff whether you like it or not. And then there's also the fact that you're like, well, what happened in her past? I kind of want to know. Is she going to go into berserk mode and then suddenly become an absolute monster? Because that'd be kind of cool. I don't know, I want to see. It's just got that fun element to it. And also, Shadow of the Gods is very Norse and Viking inspired. So if that's a setting that you really enjoy, then chances are you're going to quite like that series. Next up, we have a cozy fantasy, and that would be Legends and Lattes. This is definitely very, very popular at this point, as is cozy fantasy as a whole. If you're somebody who's looking for more cozy fantasy recommendations, I did a whole guide to cozy fantasy, so I'll have that linked. But what I really appreciate about the series is not just how well the aesthetic of the story is represented, that feeling of being in a coffee shop and all the nice smells and the music in the background and the tasty, yummy treats and things like that. While it's done very well, and I loved that about this, the reason I really wanted to have it on this list is because our main character is experiencing sort of that shift in life, which so many people at various different stages will experience. You've been doing the same thing for a really long time. You used to have a dream, you followed that dream, and now your dream is starting to change and it's starting to look a little different. And it's not just something that people experience later. I have found that a lot of people experience this in their 20s, their 30s. Sometimes people love their job for a really long time and then they want a career shift in their 50s or 60s. It's just something that so many of us can relate to. So our main character is an orc who previously was very battle-hardened and was part of a group that would accept jobs and go on these epic quests. And now she's ready to just settle down and open up a coffee shop. And she's trying to embrace these new challenges that come with having a business, getting the word out about it, building the shop. If it needs repairs, who do I contact for that? And she's kind of trying to build something from the ground up, and she's doing it at a much later stage in her life. So I just think that that alone is something that so many people are going to appreciate. Plus, Viv is just a really likable character, and if you do enjoy this one, there is a prequel where you can go back and you can see her when she was a little bit younger, a little bit more naive, and was ready to embrace adventure in life as opposed to quiet contentment in life. So I really like that you get these full perspectives of Viv's life. Next up, we have a series that it is a continuation series. If you wanted to read this, the author herself has said you can pick up with this new part of the series. I would recommend, even though I'm not the author, I would recommend starting at the beginning because I just think there's so much context that you're going to want. But regardless, we have fragile threads of power. I do think something that is very great about continuations, I'm very picky about continuations, but one thing they can do well, if you do have some of your characters from the original series, is how they look back at the events from before and how they've grown and how they change. And you really have a hard time doing that within a single trilogy or quartet. It's not until you kind of branch out and extend that you can look at that, you know, you step back and have more of a bird's eye view of things, and you actually have the time for characters to reflect on things that have transpired before. And as a result of this being the first in continuation series, you do take the time to do that. And I actually think that the very first book in the series, A Darker Shade of Magic, it kind of starts out getting you acclimated to everything, and then once it starts, it moves. And the second book, same thing. Once it gets going, it moves, and then it moves right into the third, and there's some like ups and downs with the pacing, but for the most part, that series moves pretty fast. And so it's kind of nice to then start this series with some introspection and the processing of a lot of the traumatic events from before. That said, it did create sort of a shift in pacing from what was previously established, as you do spend a lot of time just kind of sitting with the characters as they're figuring out the next phase of their life and where they're even going to go from here. And it did make for this to have a slower beginning. However, I loved that. I don't feel like you get to see that very often in series, and I so appreciated that. And you do get some new perspectives, you get some new threats, the world opens up a little bit more, and I just thought that was so much fun. I have an entire playlist dedicated to V.E. Schwab if you are interested in hearing more about it. And if you have read that book and you want to see some spoiler thoughts, I did a discussion with some of my friends who also have their own channel, so I'll have that linked as well. But Fragile Threads of Power, I can't wait. I'm just so sad. I'm like, can we please get an announcement for the release date of the next one? Because I need it sooner rather than later. Next up, one of my favorite series of all time officially. I read it this year and I'm so in love with it. And that would be Age of Madness. I love Age of Madness so much. It's so stupid how good it is. But anyway, so this series is also a continuation series. I'm so sorry. But regardless, Age of Madness is so good. I do not recommend starting necessarily right with A Little Hatred, which would be the first book in this trilogy, as there's a lot of context that you will not have, and certain character dynamics and relationships are not, you won't have that. It's going to go over your head. And I do think some of the reveals in the story or some of the pivotal moments are not going to hit as hard, or they're going to feel very random where you're like, well, okay, what the heck? How was I supposed to ever know that? And but I want people to read Age of Madness because it's so good, but I feel bad being that person that's like, even if you don't love the first trilogy, just like push through it so you can get to the second trilogy, because that's a big ask. I understand that's a big ask, but it's so good. But anyway, the whole point of talking about it today is because there are adult perspectives in this. There are some younger perspectives as well, but you do also get a wide variety of ages in this, and some of them are adults, and some of them are just so done with the world because they've seen it all. They're tired of how everything is, and they don't have a lot of hope. They don't have a lot of optimism. There's one character in particular that she is somebody who has had some really awful things happen to her, and she's had to make some really terrible choices to survive. And when that character gets like a little glimmer of hope, you're like, oh, please, for the sake of this one character, can something go right for once? Because you're like, look at them trying to like forgive themselves and then live for more and try to do the right thing. So there's that character. And then there's another character who, he's a family man. He has a wife and a daughter, and he's obviously extremely traumatized from things in his past. He seems almost addicted, though, to returning to violence. And you want also so badly for this character to just have something go right in their life so they do not have to keep taking part in. And also there's the question of, do they actually have to take part in these things? And it's just such a push and pull, and Abercrombie is so good at making you love characters and then hate characters, or love characters and then be extremely disappointed in characters, and then hate characters and be like, wait a second, are they actually becoming a good person? No, they're not. And then there's just such a wide range of feelings that you have with these characters, but the ones that have lived through more and they know the ways of the world, and yet they still almost like fall victim to optimism. You're like, which I'm not trying to say if you're optimistic, you're wrong or anything like that. I just mean that series is so bleak that when you do have those characters wanting for something else, something better, you're like, I want things to be better for them. And it's interesting the way Abercrombie does it. It's so good. It's so good. Next up, though, I've talked about this series a number of times, and that would be The Sword Defiant. I should say I've talked about this first book in the series quite a few times. This is very much a reflection of what has happened in your life and how do you even keep going. So I was talking about with T. Kingfisher's work, What Moves the Dead, how you do get a lot of a character reflecting on the violence they've experienced and PTSD. And I feel like that's pretty much a central theme to our main character, as they were that person that accomplished the great thing. They defeated the Dark Lord, and now they don't know what to do next with life. And they always kind of feel like a fight is still coming. And sometimes there isn't, and then maybe there also is, and you don't want that to be true for them, but you're like, is this good for them if this happens? Because then they feel like they have a purpose again, or is it bad because then they're just forced right back into it? And what happens if there is something and then they get through this next thing? Are they going to be that much more on edge after? And I think it asks a lot of those tough questions. And I think that it helps us empathize with anybody who's experienced trauma to a point that the character in this story has. And it does have, the next book has been released, so hopefully soon I can get to that. But I think that theme is done exceptionally well in this story. But we have one more for today. I don't actually have a physical copy, but I wanted to mention it really quick, and that would be Rise of the Ranger. This is epic fantasy, and you do get a lot of perspectives, but the main perspective, you could argue, would be Asher. And Asher is very cool. And Asher is a very mysterious character. You're first introduced to this epic tale through him when he is a young boy in the prologue, which is very explosive. And then all of a sudden something has transpired that you don't quite know the details around. But then suddenly Asher seems like he's been transported to a different time. And then you go to the first chapter, you go into the rest of the story, and when you see Asher again, he is a grown man. And you're like, what happened in between? First off, what happened before in the prologue? What's going on there? And then also you're like, what happened in that time span from when he was a boy to now? And he's mysterious, interesting, skilled, apathetic, unsure if he really cares to believe in something greater, this greater cause, this greater purpose. He's kind of just been going through life kind of as a vagabond, and he does sort of get pulled into an epic quest, and he's sort of the slightly cranky but also very skilled person who is a part of the party. And there are other characters as well that are older. There's some elf characters that they feel young even though they're a lot older, but they themselves have parents or mentor characters who are older. So you do get a wide range in this series as well. But I definitely think if you like epic fantasy and if you like that character that is sort of rough and gruff, been there, done that, but okay, I'll get pulled into this quest, you might really like this individual. That's it though for some fantasy works with actual adult characters. And what's nice is a lot of these, while they do all have adult characters, the stories with those adult characters and the paths that they're on are not all the same. We're looking at truly different parts of where they are in their lives, which I really appreciate. But if you're interested in any of these, I'll have them linked in the description bar. As I said about the ones discussed in previous videos, and I can say the same thing about these. If you're interested in hearing more about them, I'll try to find any reviews or anything like that so you can hear more in-depth thoughts. But that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. Feel free to leave your recommendations in the comments down below. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.